My name is Mara Mallory. I work in public engagement at the University of New Brunswick, and I'll be moderating tonight's panel discussion called Can Science Save New Brunswick? I would like to begin by respectfully acknowledging that Fredericton stands on the traditional Wolastoqey land. The river that runs through our city is known as Wolastoq, along which live the Wolastoqig, the people of the bountiful and beautiful river. Wolastoq is also called the St. John River. I'd like to thank Fredericton High School for opening their theater to us. This theater has been refurbished over the years. You might notice that new upholstery on the chairs, so they did ask that we refrain from drinking any coffee or tea on those nice new chairs. Tonight we're here to ask the question and possibly answer it, can science save New Brunswick? And I'd like to start by telling you a little bit about our panelists. Dr. Ted McDonald is a well-known economist and founding director of the New Brunswick Institute for Data Research and Training. If you haven't heard of the NBIRDT, let me tell you that it is one of the unsung heroes of evidence-informed decision-making in Canada. Dr. Ted McDonald has worked tirelessly with government and other stakeholders to create a rich data platform of pseudonymized and linked administrative and health data. His team helps academic and healthcare researchers, program leaders, and government get the objective, unvarnished truth about how policies, conditions, and circumstances truly affect New Brunswick. He has published over 60 papers in peer-reviewed academic journals, co-authored a book on immigration, and won national awards for advancing the cause of economic research and data science. When Dr. McDonald speaks on the topic of gathering evidence to inform decisions, the country's researchers listen. Thanks to Dr. McDonald, New Brunswick decision makers have access to one of the richest fonts of data in the country to help them make good evidence-informed decisions. Dr. Herb Emery is the Vaughan Chair in Regional Economics at the University of New Brunswick and the Program Director at the Atlantic Institute for Policy Research. You may know him from his regular columns in the Telegraph Journal, but that only represents the tip of the iceberg of what Dr. Emery does in his work here at UNB. Prior to arriving at UNB in 2016, Dr. Emery held the SVAR Chair in Health Economics at the University of Calgary, a joint position with the Faculty of Medicine and the Department of Economics. From 2010 to 2015, he served as managing editor of the Canadian Public Policy Analyse de Politique, Canada's foremost journal examining economic and social policy. Here at UNB, Dr. Emery and his research team look into the hows, the whats, and the whys of economic and social conditions that affect New Brunswickers every day. Karen White-Masry has been in the world of policymaking for over 18 years. She is a professional engineer with a master's degree in chemical engineering from the University of New Brunswick. She began her career as a project manager with the Department of Environment before moving into increasingly responsible roles in the development of policy and programs for both the Department of Environment, Public Health, and the Office of the Chief Medical Officer of Health. Karen has worked collaboratively across government and with stakeholders to study, recommend, and implement policy and legislation. She recently founded Aviz Consulting, a consulting firm specializing in helping organizations create healthy workplaces and environments. And last but not least, Lisa Ravlick. Lisa is an award-winning journalist turned award-winning New Brunswick business owner. Lisa is the founder of Wicked Ideas Media, New Brunswick's first B Corp. There's perhaps nobody in the province who's more adept at taking the temperature of New Brunswickers on controversial issues than Lisa. She and former UNB President John McLaughlin founded NextNB, a province-wide public outreach initiative that inspired the creation of the New Brunswick Business Council, the Wallace McCain Institute, 21 Inc., and in fact the Research Institute, which Dr. Emery now heads. She authored the book New Brunswick Underwater, about the devastating floods of 2016, and she helps governments, corporations, and nonprofits rebuild public trust in our institutions and reduce the tension around polarizing complex issues. I can't imagine where you'd find your clients these days. And now on to the meat of the discussion. I want to frame this panel discussion with a little story. In November 2012, the world's eyes were on the voters of California. They were voting on a bill that could profoundly impact the industrial food supply chain throughout the United States. The formal name of the bill was of Proposition 37 was the California Right to Know Genetically Engineered Food Act. The bill, if passed, would require food labeling of genetically engineered foods and prohibit any kind of branding of those foods as natural as natural. So in the lead up to the vote, Californians were solidly behind the proposition. The underlying message of the Yes campaign was that people have the right to know what they are consuming, and they have the right to choose not to consume genetically engineered foods. It resonated with people. The modest $6.8 million Yes campaign was funded by small food producers, organic farmers, and natural food stores. On the other side, the massive $46 million No campaign was led by corporate giants like Kraft, Monsanto, General Mills, and Pepsi. They claimed the legislation was unnecessarily alarmist when there was no science that suggested that GMO foods were harmful, and it was full of loopholes for special interest groups. Now I'm going to stop with the story right there. I'm going to ask you all to check your gut. If you were in California in November 2012, and that was all you knew about this issue, what was said in the Yes campaign and what was said in the No campaign, how would you vote? I'm not going to ask you to show a show of hands for yes or no, but just think about it. How would you vote? So now I'm going to continue on about what the scientists had to say. And what they had to say didn't really make it out into the public as much because it couldn't fit in a 140-character tweet or on a billboard or in a five-second sound clip. The American Medical Association, the association that represents all the doctors in the United States, was on the no side. To them, the legislation could cause more harm than good. There was a danger in creating the perception that foods for which there was no proof of harm were somehow unhealthy or unnatural. The World Health Organization, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the National Science Academy, all came out also on the no side. Their issues were twofold. Scientific literature had reconfirmed and reconfirmed the lack of evidence of any harm caused by these foods. People have been eating forms of modified organisms and plants for hundreds of years, and often produced through decades of breeding and crossbreeding programs. As Dr. Henry Miller, a fellow of the Hoover Institute at Stanford University and founder of the FDA's Office of Biotechnology, wrote, "Food labeling policy should be based on logic and science, not fear. Leading scientific organizations have all agreed that foods containing genetically engineered ingredients are safe and are not materially different from their traditional counterparts." The second issue was that the language of the bill reflected and reinforced the positions that GMO foods are inherently bad and to be avoided. Couching the issue in terms of knowledge and, quote unquote, the right to know, assumes one thing, that labeling will in any way be informative. The impact of creating a negative and misleading perception of these foods could actually be quite damaging. As Pamela Ronald, a geneticist at the University of California at Davis, wrote, "Everything we eat has been genetically altered using some kind of genetic technique. Modern genetic approaches are no more risky than the older conventional approaches, and in some cases, one could argue there's even less risk because they are well characterized and they're regulated." Scientists pointed out that many GMO foods, far from being frankenfoods, have offered us significant nutritional and supply advantages. Golden rice was genetically modified to have beta-carotene to supply needed vitamin A to Asian populations suffering deficiencies. Papayas have been bred with immunization against a virulent virus that nearly destroyed Hawaii's papaya industry. Tomatoes have been genetically engineered to have extra lycopene, an antioxidant that promotes heart health and lowers the risk of certain cancers. So now after that, let me ask you, if you're that voter in California, after having heard that, have you changed your vote? This I'll ask you for a show of hands. Did anyone change their vote? My gut initially, I changed my vote. Monsanto, when I hear the word Monsanto, that might set me off. So Proposition 37 was narrowly defeated, and scientists rejoiced, But they also did a lot of soul searching about how they communicate with the public and how ready the public is to hear about the science part of the art and science of policymaking. So now I'm going to lead off some questions to our panelists. I'm going to ask each one of them a question, and I'm going to invite the other panelists to chime in if they've got any additional commentary after each one of the panelists answers. So I'll start with Dr. McDonald. Ted, your organization analyzes data every day to inform our collective understanding about New Brunswick's healthcare, our economy, social policy questions. Why is it so hard to get a definitive yes, no, or black and white answer from science?
Thanks, Mara. And I'm going to illustrate what the challenges are using a bit of a case study. So I want to start by asking the question, how much alcohol is safe? How much alcohol can we consume safely? If this was a laboratory with a chemical reaction and we add compound A to compound B and we always get result C, then we know the answer. But it's about people, and people are complicated. So, and I understand, and it's certainly understandable why there's so much skepticism and confusion about the link between alcohol and health. And it could be alcohol, it could be red meat, it could be coffee, it could be anything. It could be glyphosate. So why is it so hard to figure out, to get the answer, if it's just basic, sort of, basic science? Why don't we know the answer? Why is getting a definitive answer so challenging? So I'm going to take you through a few reasons, and this is partly as my experience personally as a researcher doing work in the area. And so the first one, why don't we just use a laboratory? Well, a laboratory is good for mice, and you can take mice and you can subject them to alpha alcohol in certain concentrations, and then you can measure health and tumor development and heart disease. I don't know if mice get heart disease, I suppose they do. But does it generalize to people? So what can we do? Well, there is something called a randomized control trial. And all new drugs go through this randomized control trial. And the idea basically is we try and simulate a lab experiment in a laboratory by saying we're going to have a bunch of people, we're going to assign them randomly to what's called a treatment and what's called a control. And the treatment gets the drug, that say we're interested in a new drug, and the control gets a placebo, and then we just measure the differences. So a lot of science is done like that. And it works, and you're allowed to do this if it's prospectively going to help you. So you see randomized control trials about exercise plans and yoga as a stress reliever and new drugs, but you can't do that with things that may be bad for you. Ethically, you can't do that. So what you're not allowed to do is say, okay, we're going to take a randomized control trial, we're going to take 100 people, and we're going to get them to drink 3 drinks a day or 5 drinks a day for the next year. You're just not allowed to do that. It's not ethical to do that, to subject people to something that could be harmful. Now, certain examples, you can certainly self-identify. So Morgan Spurlock did this for 30 days with McDonald's, and we watch what happens there. But by and large, we're not allowed to do that, and for very good reasons. So what we have to do in terms of relying on the links between things like that, like diet, obesity, coffee, things like that, is we have to use observational trials. We have to look at what people are actually doing in their lives, and we ask them, we survey them. So what did you do? How much did you use? And what were your health effects? So we need to go and get observational data. And that gets into the second problem, that unlike a lot of things in the physical sciences, data have to come from people. And so if we're going to ask people, and I won't ask for a show of hands, if we're going to ask people, so you're part of a survey, we want to look at the links between alcohol and heart disease or alcohol and cancer, and we're going to gather information from you regularly, periodically surveys, and Statistics Canada does this, and I'll say, okay, looking over the past year, how many drinks did you have a day on average? How many times in the last year did you have 5 or more drinks, which we call a binge, and things like that. So we're going to ask you to talk about what your experiences were. And there's 2 challenges there. One is what we call recall bias, which is you're asking me about something I did a year ago or 6 months ago. I'm going to ballpark it. I'm going to get it wrong unless I'm keeping a meticulous journal. And the second one that's more concerning is it's called self-reporting bias. And when you're asked sensitive questions, people tend maybe not to want to tell the truth. So if I ask you in a laboratory setting, how many drinks did you have last week? You may know what the number is, but you may hesitate to tell me how big that number is. So we get this reporting bias. People understate. And this is just because we're gathering data from lived experience rather than in a lab in that kind of structure. So we rely on observational studies, and we have these problems. And even then, we say, well, do we even agree on what a standard drink is? So some people may know that a standard drink is 12 ounces of beer at 5% strength. So if you go to the Joyce and you have a 6.8% IPA that's in 20 ounces, that's about 2.5 drinks. So there's all kinds of issues about that reporting. I know it's alarming.
But who's counting?
I wish I didn't know that. The third thing is research bias. And this is a big problem. Now, the vast majority of researchers, we're not overly biased, we're not making up results, we're not fabricating evidence, but we still face challenges. And one of them, journals, we call publication bias. So academics, we need to publish in academic journals. That's what determines whether we get a job. It determines whether we get tenure. It determines whether we get promotion. It tells us whether we get grants that allow us to travel to nice places. It's the fundamental sort of measurement stick. And journals like to publish stuff that finds a result, a significant result. So if I'm in a situation and I have a bunch of data and I run 20 different models, statistical models, on the links between having 2 glasses of red wine a day and heart disease, and I find that 19 of them show no effect, and one of them does, I'm going to publish the one that does, because that's what's going to get published, because people want to see a result. And more importantly, if you have a really big, high-flashing result, then that can make a career. Like Thomas Piketty's book Capital, he's a rock star. And because he had this book, and it was just captured the popular domain, because people want to see something positive. Non-results, well, we didn't find anything, that's not so interesting. And also, and Herb mentioned this the other day, if you're going to do what we call replication studies, so I'm going to take your data and your approach and see if I can get your results, it doesn't tend to make you friends when you find something that you can't, that what they found you can't replicate. The third one, and I will try and speed this up a bit, is time frame. People are complicated. So we know asbestos causes cancer, but when this started, it takes 30 years, to say between 20 and 30 years for cancer to manifest itself, long past the exposure. So long-term effects require lots of data, and a lot can happen between that exposure and outcome. What about your diet, activity, health screening, other environmental hazards, stress, social change? All those things matter as well. So we need lots of data, and we need to be able to try and account for all of those things to try and isolate, well, what actually is the role of alcohol? My final point, and you've all heard this in some way or another, correlation's not causality. So what does that mean? I'll give you an example. Suppose in my study, and I've done this 100 times, and I found one significant result, and I published that, I find 2 glasses of red wine a day is associated with a lower risk of heart disease compared to drinking less than 2 glasses of red wine a day and more than 2 glasses of red wine a day. So what's the policy response? Well, let's advocate moderate drinking is good for you. And we saw that a number of years ago. Moderate drinking is good for your health. It's good for heart health. However, suppose that those 2 people drinking 2 glasses of red wine a day, they also eat more fish, they eat less red meat, they exercise more, they have more education, they have better jobs that pay more and with less stress. All of those things are important to health, and they're all related to the decision to drink red wine. So red wine on itself is correlated with all those things, but is red wine actually making your health better? It's not. And in fact, if you didn't have all these other protective effects, red wine might be actually making your health worse. So the challenge to try and disentangle all those things, all the things it could be from what we're really interested in, which is where the policy prescription comes in, is really difficult. So I think the next question that we get for all of us is what's good science? And I'm going to stop there, and then I have some ideas about what good science is. But these are the challenges that we face in doing this kind of work.
So on the topic of good science, and this question goes to Dr. Emery, as we all know, and as Ted mentioned or alluded to, one day red wine's good for you, one day red wine's bad for you, sometimes eggs are good for you, sometimes eggs are bad for you. Science sometimes sends a clear signal, and sometimes science doesn't send any signal at all. So what do you do when you've got conflicting evidence? How are we supposed to navigate that, and what are the implications for policymaking?
So that's a tough question. I want to talk about it in the context of how someone like Ted or I could actually help a decision be made in government. And I just want to start with a quote that was kind of a showstopper for me a few years ago. And it's, "The aim of science is not to open the door to infinite wisdom, but to set a limit to infinite error." And so right off the bat, what I'm trying to do, and when I help, is not actually come up with an answer, but try to help a decision maker avoid a mistake. So we don't have the ability with science to come forward and say, this is what you must do. We know with certainty this is going to occur. We're always going to be stuck with, we don't know if it's the right thing to do. We've got a signal that says it's okay. It may not be harmful, but that doesn't really help someone who's in the hot seat and someone's looking at them saying, what do we do? Especially if you get into an emergency situation like, how do we make the world a better place when things are starting to crumble down around you? And we come in and we say, well, this is kind of looking good. We don't instill a lot of confidence. So when we think about it, the role of science and evidence in decision-making process is not to provide answers or certainty, because we can't do that. But we can try and help reduce the decision set, the number of options that you have to consider. And I've been told by a number of decision makers that that's absolutely useless. If narrowing it down from 1 million choices to 999,000 hasn't really helped the situation. But I walked out very happy with what I did and said, we clearly have a communication problem. So when you think about it, how can we help with decision making? There's two big questions that when we say walk into a room and someone says, help us make a decision, they want to know two things. If they make a decision or take an action, will there be a benefit? And not probably, which is the most I could ever say to them. The second question they have, is it safe or will it harm anyone? Because those are the two big considerations. You want to make things better moving forward. You don't want to harm anyone as much as possible. And so you want to get answers to those questions, and we're kind of limited to what we can say about that. As Ted noted, we're able to say things about efficacy. In a controlled situation, we can run an experiment or do a demonstration to show that an effect exists. So I can give everyone $5 and see if they buy more beer at the James Joyce and get their drink counts up. It's very controlled, unless you're out with some of my friends, I guess. And from there, we then say, well, that worked really well. Let's get everybody drinking heavily. And at that point, we start to notice the benefits aren't there anymore. Something's gone horribly wrong. And this is what's going on in a lot of the policy world, is decision makers started listening to people like me, and they noticed that our controlled studies weren't diffusing into benefits in the broader world. There was a problem that when you scaled the intervention to the population level, the benefits weren't being seen. And so now you have a political crisis on your hands. These economists told you if you cut this tax rate, you'd have so much money, you wouldn't know what to do with it all. You'd be building all kinds of stuff, and then you'd borrow it against it, and then the money never occurred. And so they look and say, well, clearly it was a flawed study, or maybe it was just we never had the generalizability in the first place. And that's where we always have to be cautious that when we go in, we're using language that's scientific. The problem on the communications part is the scientific language is weak. It says we might be able to do this. It looks good. We've got some probability. We have confidence. What the decision maker often wants is certainty, a strong statement, that they can go forward knowing that this will work, because you need that kind of optimism if you're going to stay in power. So we're often also good at quantifying costs of interventions, but we can't get the benefits that we have to balance against it. And then the other problem we have is we can never prove safety. The best we can do is demonstrate there's no obvious harms or an absence of evidence of harm, which is not really comforting for a lot of people. As Ted said, it might take 30 years. So if we do this, is it safe? I don't know, but there's no evidence of harm. That's not the same thing in the minds of a lot of people, that they don't want to take that risk. And so telling them an absence of harm is there isn't going to put their minds at ease. So even if we have a clear signal on benefit, we still have to figure out how we're going to weigh that balance of cost. Now, what we wind up with when we don't have certainty or answers, we wind up with a criteria called, air quotes, the strength of evidence. And the strength of evidence is you'll start noticing we had things like good science. We start adding modifiers so that we want to try and differentiate what we do from what someone else did, potentially a rival result. But at this point, we're not doing science anymore. We're doing marketing and sales. So if I come in and I say, well, the strength of evidence shows I'm right, and another side comes in and they say their strength of evidence shows that they're right, we still need some way to decide who's got science on their side. And what we've tried to do historically is have expert bodies who are tasked with reviewing evidence, like the National Energy Board, like Health Canada, whose job it was to stay between citizens and the policymakers and come in with what's their best assessment about, is there a benefit, is there going to be a harm? And that worked well for a while, but then we started seeing situations where people weren't happy with the regulators' decisions. And increasingly what we're seeing is the public wants to question the decisions being made, say, by a Health Canada and, say, by a National Energy Board. And when we have governments who say we will not necessarily accept the advice of the body, at that point we're into a different world. Evidence has to figure out a new way to be assessed and aggregated. And so what we're seeing more and more is that we're starting to have lay assessment of evidence as opposed to expert assessment of evidence. And when you do try to do expert assessment, you'll see more often than not, it's the experts who are taken down, not the evidence itself. So if you say who funded your study and you said Monsanto, the public will turn right off. They don't care about what the evidence shows anymore. They view that as no longer a basis for good science. And this is a war that's going on inside the universities now to get private money out of the universities. So we run into this problem that we have to figure out how we balance benefits and harms to make a decision. And if we don't have the experts' advice, we have to think about weighing benefits versus harms in situations where some people get the benefits and other people are going to get the harms. And so the harm in this case can just be you don't want to be dosed with a chemical, but because we picked a mandatory program, you have to accept it. And we tell you that evidence says it's okay, but you will still have the psychological harm of knowing that this is being done to you against your will. And I'll give you some examples of where this has happened. This is all pretty abstract, and I want to give you some examples to think about where a regulatory body, decision experts in these decisions, have come forward and said something is okay to do. And I don't want to see a show of hands because it could cause a fight, but I want to go through you thinking about, do you agree that the strength of evidence supports the following? Not recommending higher vitamin D intake over 800 international units per day. Is that upsetting anyone?
I don't even know what that means.
So this is the biggest fight I've ever been involved in evidence-based decision making. We wanted Health Canada to consider 2,000 international units per day, and it wound up being something that took down a whole bunch of researchers and everything else because Health Canada was quite upset about the decision. How about keeping chlorine in drinking water? Are we comfortable with that? Generally a good thing to do, chlorine. How about fluoride in the drinking water? This is one of the most contested debates that you will find. Is it safe to have fluoride in the water? Does it have benefits? Can we remove it? So the strength of evidence, you'll see arguments saying it's safe, it's been beneficial for health. You will run into some of the biggest organized international lobby groups to get fluoride out of the water because it's a poison. I have no clue if it's a poison. All I know is that a lot of people accuse me of genocide for writing an op-ed saying it appears to have reduced cavities. So here's another one we ran into. Does the strength of evidence support the continued use of mercury amalgam fillings in dentistry? Mercury is a known neurotoxin that does harm to the brain. It's been put into people for years, and the question is, when do you have to stop using it? And it's the only device or object put into the human body that until you demonstrate there's harm, it's allowed to be continued. The usual regulatory framework is you must prove it's safe before it's allowed to be used. So for now, it carries on. I think it's around 40 to 50% of dentists are still using mercury amalgam fillings instead of the more plasticky BPA ones, which they argue is actually more dangerous. So we don't necessarily ever. And then, of course, Ted raised the forbidden word glyphosate, Roundup, in forestry. Health Canada declared it safe in its intended use and in agriculture as well. In Saskatchewan, they celebrated that decision. In New Brunswick, it has not been met with the same support. So what's the strength of evidence? Does it even matter? Should we have mandatory vaccination of school-aged children? Does the strength of evidence support that? Should we continue not allowing cigarettes to be sold in high schools? When I went to high school, we had a machine selling cigarettes in the cafeteria. When they tried to remove it, everyone fought it. It was civil liberties. So now, fast forward to today, and this is a recent hot button one. Should we allow junk food to be sold in our schools? What does the strength of evidence say? And this is one that, as you know, the chocolate milk war was fought, I think, a year ago, and chocolate milk is in the schools. I'm not even sure if chocolate milk is healthy or unhealthy at this point. All I know is it became a flashpoint. So when we think about why is there so much dispute, it's because science is really good at some things, telling us a signal about does something work in a controlled situation. But as we move into the messy world of policy and politics, it doesn't have the clarity that can really help resolve some of these big issues. And in some cases, it's probably been overused as a hammer to sort of drive through people who really just didn't agree with the decision. And so in a lot of cases, we've been trying to solve a values problem with evidence.
So Karen, on to you. So Karen, you have worked in policy for 18 years. It's been your job to take all the data that Ted brings you and the analysis that Herb brings you and try to assimilate it all and develop a policy that if it doesn't make everyone happy, it at least it makes the fewest people mad. So can you talk about the policy development process and what people in your role have to consider?
Yeah, absolutely. And the policy development process is probably the most boring thing you'll talk about today, so I'll try not to put anyone to sleep too much. Policy development is very complex, and there are entire professional degree programs dedicated to public policy and policy administration. And it's always been important to me I was so excited to talk today about evidence-informed decision-making because this is something that I have always taken to heart throughout my entire career. And one of the things that I recognize is that when we talk about policy, people don't necessarily know what that means. So the kind of policy that we've been talking about so far, those are big policy. Those are acts, right? Those are the kinds of things that are debated and approved through the legislature. And those need very solid evidence and very rigorous reviews. But there are also all kinds of other levels of policy that are allowed through the Act to be developed and implemented at the department level. And that might be something as simple as a sign that says, probably don't want to go swimming there because there's blue-green algae in the water. Or it might be something as complex as dealing with those things that you've all been talking about so far. And I've been involved in some of those things too, so they're pretty painful. But in each case, it does not matter whether you're talking about a sign that has to be posted or whether you're talking about an act that has to consider great economic implications. All of those pieces of policy have to be fair and equitable. They have to be well-informed, and they have to be cost-effective. And so whether you're developing a sign or a directive or an act, there's somebody whose job it is, and me or my team when I worked for government, whose job it is to take all of that stuff that Herb and Ted have been talking about, know where to find it, seek it out, decipher that information, and you can imagine how hard that is, and also include, like, this is just science. You also have to do jurisdictional reviews, and you have to look at the qualitative information that might have come to you through engagement that you've had. And engagement might be something as simple as the conversation that a regulator has with a facility operator, or something as complex as a complete stakeholder engagement framework that informs a policy. And all of that information has to be considered, and hopefully there's a team of people and not just one person who has to dig through all of that and try to make sense of it. And so imagine trying to make sense of something that scientists, researchers, economists are telling you is, may or may not be valid. So it's very, very complicated. Having said that, there are different opportunities that we would take as policymakers to help us make those decisions a bit more easily. So Herb talked a little bit about Health Canada. And so we in the government would often participate in things that are called provincial, federal, territorial groups on a particular topic. And that's where you might have a group like Health Canada who's done the evidence reviews and who's looked at all the information, and whether or not you might agree with that or not, that's the information that they're pulling forward. And they're communicating that once or twice a year with representatives across Canada to try to share ideas and think through how that science might be incorporated into policy that you could use and make useful, and that might be actually acceptable to the public. So that is one tool, but there's also other groups, and IRDT is hugely valuable, and groups like the National Collaborating Centres that are funded through the Public Health Agency of Canada, who do evidence reviews, and they do webinars, and they give all kinds of information that help train and allow policymakers to begin to develop those. Hopefully they already have them, but they're also continuously developing those critical thinking skills to look through all these different pieces of information and say, hey, what makes sense, so that they can then put forward a recommendation for a policy. And then the policy process itself is completely dependent on the policy that's being developed. So it might be something that you could have approved by a director or an ADM or a deputy minister, or if you're developing an act or regulation to address some of the things that Herb and Ted were talking about, those are things that now have to go through a whole other rigorous process. So if you're developing an act, you then would engage with the policy branch that is housed in each department to start looking at, now they've taken all the science and information that's been put forward, and they're looking at a policy recommendation and putting it into a memorandum to Executive Council, which is a standardized form process that looks at all the information. And you have to start putting what we call lenses on that. So what does this now new policy, how is it going to impact our healthcare? How is it going to impact maybe a minority group? How is it going to impact youth? And you're now looking at science in the context of a whole lot of other things to determine whether or not a policy is really going to make a difference, and is it going to meet an objective that you're trying to achieve. And so one of the things that you do throughout that process, and it can happen at different stages throughout policy development, but that's engagement. And I can't overestimate how important engagement is. And I just want to sort of draw to you an example of something that I was able to go to the Canadian Public Health Association conference last year, and I listened to the US Surgeon General talk. And it was so amazing to listen to him talk, and he really drew attention to having the diversity of perspective at the center of any time that you develop a policy. So all the science matters, and it is so, so important, but also you've got to look at both sides. And so he talked about vaccination, and he said if you're developing policies and you want to make sure that you're developing the best policy, then you need to invite the anti-vaxxers at the table. So that is a form of engagement that will happen very, very early. And we don't always have the opportunity to do that, but when you can and put that diversity of perspective at the center of any policy, I think that makes for much better policy making. So science is important. It's very, very important. But so is all of the other lenses that we put on it and a policy. And I think one of the things that, just to leave you with a few pieces of information about policy that really matter to me, is that policy is not static. Okay, so you develop a policy and we don't always get it right, and science is always changing. So the better information that you have and the better engagement that you have, then that yields better policy. And policy is complex. It's really difficult, really hard to decipher through some of this information, and especially not to put your own personal bias when you're looking at this information as well. And, I think about oftentimes as a policymaker, you're pretty sure that most of the time you're not making anybody happy. You're trying your best, but you're not making anybody happy. And so I almost would like you to look to your left and look to your right or look behind you, and there are policymakers all around you in the room today, and give them a little bit of gratitude because they've had to decipher all of this information and probably don't get a lot of encouragement. So.
Thanks, Karen. So, Lisa, you have traveled this province on Good News public engagement outreach programs. You have traveled this province on really, really contentious engagement programs. You've also been a journalist for over 20 years. So can you tell us about your experiences in observing and engaging the public as they try to grapple with controversial policies?
Sure. So I love working in crisis. I really enjoy it because I love talking with people and understanding what lies behind that first sentence that people utter. I really want to get beneath the surface and understand. And so I have covered all sorts of controversial issues in New Brunswick. I've covered Indigenous land rights. I've covered the arrival of all forms of oil and gas and pipelines that have come into this province over the past 20 years. And of course, I worked on the Fracking Commission. And then just as a journalist, I covered education reform, health reform, all these different things. And one thing, I've learned a few things. So the first thing that I have observed is that most of us, whether we are the wealthiest, the poorest, the oldest, or the youngest, mistake our self-interest for the public interest. We believe that our opinion is in the best interest of the community, and we are all wrong in that assumption because it is the combination of all of these self-interests taking the best of each that makes a public interest. So none of us, no matter how brilliant or experienced we are, can fully represent the public interest. It is a collective opinion and a collective belief. Which brings me to point number 2. All of us, on every single issue, every single one of you, are kind of right about all of the issues that we've talked about at this table, at this panel. All of you, so congratulations. But that also means you're all kind of wrong. So you're kind of right and you're kind of wrong about every issue you personally hold an opinion on. We all are. But here's the thing. You don't get to pick what you're kind of wrong about. And that's what makes it difficult. Because in order for us to reach consensus, we all might have to let go of something that we hold dear, that is a part of how we identify ourselves, what group we feel we belong to. We might have to let go of a little bit of that in order for a consensus to be built. And that's really, really hard. But that's the work that I love doing. Because in order to solve any of these big issues, it's going to take all of us to recognize that we're going to take a little bit from all of these different opinions and stitch them together to find a new path forward, which is my third point. None of these issues are either or proposition. It's not pipelines or no pipelines. It's not glyphosate or no glyphosate. It's not closing ERs or keeping them open. It's something else. When we come to an impasse on these issues, it's because we have framed the question improperly. We've asked the wrong question. And often we've asked the wrong question because we're asking it from the here and now, from our self-interested point of view, not from the public interest point of view. And this is true of government, of industry, and citizens. We all do this, right? So government often comes to a conversation with a financial imperative, right? It's going to increase taxes, it's going to cut costs, something like that, right? But the public doesn't care about any of that. You have a different reason for coming to the table in that conversation. So it's about reframing the question in a way that represents the value proposition, the values that each of the groups at the table hold dear and that we can all agree on, right? The one general large value that we all want. And to build up from there, that new idea and that new path forward. And that takes time. However, it doesn't take as long as trying repeatedly to get your one self-interested idea through, right? Because that's going to take you years, and you're always going to fail. But if you actually invest in real deep engagement, in being brave enough to have these conversations, you might actually get your policy written and passed in a year.
I'm trying to think of when that happened. Herb, you mentioned values and questioned whether we have a values dispute or a dispute of evidence. And Lisa, you brought in, you just made a great point about the public interest being the collective interest. How do you reconcile different values from all these different multiple groups, and can science play a role in that?
Well, I think it's about recognizing that there is, certainly there's a diversity and a spectrum within any large group. So whether you take environmentalists, or you take scientists, or you take teachers, there's diversity of thought within each of these large groups, right? And so it's about finding a consensus opinion, or the people who want to travel into that space to solve that problem. And there will be members of all these different groups or tribes or whatever we want to call that, that aren't coming with us on this journey, that are not willing to compromise and to seek. And so, God bless, have fun, right? But in order to sit at the table, we're going to have to all admit we got to let go of some stuff. So if you don't want to let go of any stuff, well, that's fine. You can go grab a sandwich. So science absolutely has a place at that table.
So I think the hope behind science was you have two groups that are fighting. They don't have any common ground. They don't seem to be getting along. And a common thing I hear is someone should just give them both the facts so they understand that they're both kind of wrong. And when they understand what the right answer is, they'll all move to the center, have a big hug, and we can move forward. Unfortunately, the science shows when you do that, they actually polarize even more, because what you get is people will filter the information that sort of fits the position they want. So there's a sense in which our hope had always been information, proof, science, irrefutable evidence that would make it so that someone who had what we would call an irrational position isn't allowed to keep it. So we don't want people to say the earth is flat. We are not comfortable with them saying that. We don't want people believing things. And so the role of science in that case was to sort of convince everyone that we have one direction we need to go, and it's not working. And part of it is a lot of the things we're doing with evidence is we're not respecting that there's values. And this comes in a lot with public health interventions, where we're going to make a compulsory program, something as simple as seatbelt legislation, if everyone can remember back when there were people driving around refusing to wear seatbelts and we had to fine them. It comes into you're going to take someone's right to choose how they want to do something, or a right not to be dosed, and you're going to trample that right. And for some people, that's a very sacred thing, and for others, they're comfortable with it. But when you come in and you say you're wrong for not wanting to wear a seatbelt because the evidence shows it saves lives, you're not going to convince that person. And so we have this problem that I think we're always trying to believe that there's just people who are wrong, and if we can just convince them they're wrong, or we ignore people who we just push aside as cranks, that will let us move forward. But then what we've seen instead is we've just picked up the fever pitch in the discussion. And what we're now looking at in Canada is everything's gridlocked.
Right.
We've hit a point now where trains aren't moving. We're not building anything. We're not making positive changes on all kinds of public health fronts. And so I think Lisa's right. There needs to be a different approach that uses evidence and science to help with maybe the small ball decisions, but the bigger questions about how do we balance someone's right not to be dosed with herd immunity, which keeps coming up. And one I'll just bring in that we had to live through, when HPV vaccination came in, we were lucky enough that our daughter was in the first age cohort that had to go through that. And I can tell you it was a lot of pressure coming from pharma and medical communities that we were going to damage our daughter forever and kill her with cancer if we didn't let this vaccination occur. And the pressure to submit to the mandatory vaccination in the public school board was pretty intense. Even though there's no direct communication like a flu virus or something else that way, it felt different, but we didn't know why, and we didn't know how we were supposed to say no. And when the Catholic board said no, in Alberta, the public health officials launched a lawsuit against the Catholic school board for rights to come in to vaccinate Catholic schoolgirls with the HPV vaccine. And at that point, we were looking at a very different use of evidence when you start trampling someone's religious beliefs in order to get herd immunity. And so that's where I think sometimes we just push too hard, and that's where we get the values flaring back.
Ted, did you have a comment?
Yeah, so my wife said on the way over, "You're not a scientist, you're an economist. Why are you up on a panel like that? What do you know about science?" So I'm going to actually make a comment on this as the point of view of an economist. And the economist's take on this would be that ultimately society determines what its values are going to be, collective values. This is what's important to us. This is not. It's not for economists to tell you what your values should be. But what research can do is to inform decisions by saying, here's the cost of doing so. If this is what society wants to do, here's what you have to give up. So at least it becomes a more informed choice. And to quote Richard Posner, who is the father of law and economics, and I talk about this in one of my classes, the demand for justice is not independent of its price. So by all means, there are going to be differences in opinion. We have very different values. And in putting in policies that are consistent with those values, just to make people aware of, here's what it's going to cost. Here's what you're giving up. And then it's up to society to say, that's a trade-off that we're worth making.
Yeah, I mean, anyone out there that knows me, I'm an eternal optimist. I really am, and it can be frustrating. But I genuinely believe, and I've been through some really difficult policy decisions, very difficult ones. But I've always found, for me, when they worked the most smoothly, is when there was very solid partnerships developed. And I'm going to use an easy example. One that was very easy was Artificial Tanning Act. That was one that we did in a year. Right. And we did it in a year for multiple reasons. One of them was that we had very good partnership with the academic community locally, so that they were doing some research on youth behaviors. And so I was able to understand it. My team was able to understand it and make sense of it because we had a really good partnership with the academic community to help us understand what it is that they were finding as part of the research. And I believe that there's an opportunity here. When you have this kind of polarization, I believe that there's an opportunity now to find a different way to get to that intersect between values and science. And I think that some of that might be through partnership, really good partnerships between government, academic community, non-government communities. And, but that's never easy because there's nobody forcing us together. So you have to find ways and find opportunities, and sometimes you have to get at that little one thing that then snowballs.
We've been very focused on very complex policies and polarizing policies, but there's also some, as you mentioned, some easier policies, and I think science can be the starting point for some of those easier policies. And maybe, Ted, you could talk about some of the great examples out of MBIRDT, such as immigration, where the data that you've been able to bring to the table has probably modified some decisions in the immigration front.
So it's interesting that one of the premier objectives for government and one of the main focuses that's seen as a plank to our economic development is immigration. Attracting and retaining immigrants to the province. We've heard about the population time bomb. We've heard about aging society. We've heard about the rural areas emptying out and the difficulty in supplying services through hospitals or schools. And immigration is going to be the salvation. Now that's a different debate, but post-secondary education, training and labor, and population growth division, whose responsibility is to attract immigrants and retain them, when they came to us and they said, this is what we have to do, but curiously, we have no way of measuring who stays. So even at sort of baseline level, a really important policy question, which is, how are we doing at keeping our immigrants working productively in New Brunswick? they have no way of answering that question beyond the anecdotal. And so they come to us, and we've got lots of data, and so we took an approach of saying, well, let's link who we know arrives from landing records and link them to Medicare registration, which no one has done before, because if you're in New Brunswick long enough to qualify for Medicare, we can see that based on our data. If you move to Ontario, we see that you move to Ontario. And even just being able to bring some basic trends, and I presented this afternoon, about how often are people, who's staying, does it matter about visa category, does it matter about where you're from, and all the factors that go along with that, at least starts to provide some evidence about how we're doing. And then that, we don't really answer questions, but we raise questions. Okay, why is it that? And that then allows policy to sort of focus in. But like the starting point for these kinds of evaluations is sometimes we don't even know anything about what's working in terms of data. So there was an unnamed deputy minister who I talked to, and he said, we're spending $10 million a year on programs, and we have no way to evaluate if it even works, aside from, well, how many people are we helping with training? That's not what you want to know. You want to know, are they moving into the workforce? So just as a starting point, bringing in evidence, and evidence needs to come from data, and liberating data is a really important starting point.
Just a counter to that we ran into in a weird way was evidence in some cases may obligate a government to act and change, that ethically, once you know the information, you can't carry on. So we ran into a situation where we had called 2 cities in Alberta, Calgary and Edmonton, and the government was tracking number of nights in homeless shelters. And we were provided with the data, and at a certain point, the Edmonton data just stopped. There was about a 5-year gap, and then it started again. So when we followed up and asked what happened, they said, well, we stopped collecting it because it was showing it wasn't growing like in Calgary. And we said, well, isn't that good news? And they said, no, that would mean we wouldn't be able to continue spending at the same rate in Edmonton, and there's a lot of pressure to spend equally. So there's situations where you run into where they don't want the information because it's going to create a bigger problem, and they can't do anything about it. In other cases, we were trying to study a domestic violence question, but to even ask the moms if there'd been a situation with their kids who had early childhood caries, if there was a domestic violence situation, that would trigger social services coming in and potentially the removal of the child, so we couldn't get it through an ethics board. So you run into problems that there's some things you just can't study.
I want to touch on trust, because that is something that has certainly come up in the headlines over the last week. In so many of today's major policy debates, whether it's vaccinations or GMO foods or glyphosate in forests, there's an underlying theme of distrust of the science and the experts unless they're validating our own position. So do we actually trust scientists today? Do we trust them more? Do we trust them less? And why?
Well, so when I talk about trust, and I think a lot about trust and how to rebuild trust, I often say when I'm starting out talking to people, we got here the old-fashioned way. It was earned. That lack of trust has been earned. Maybe not something you personally did, but the institution that you are associated with earned that distrust from the public through past actions. So history is littered with bad decisions or people being lied to or people being put through the ringer in trying to get answers or having policies thrust upon them that they didn't want, or approval being given to land developments that they didn't want. And when it comes to trust, and if we're talking specifically about government and industry, government and industry for citizens often seem to be walking hand in hand, particularly if it's a dominant industry in a region. Because for the last few decades, most governments have used as an economic measurement job creation, right? And so we can debate whether or not jobs are a good indicator of the health of an economy. But when that began to happen, then the government shifted in the eyes of the public as being the group that represented them and became the advocates for corporate interests. And so trust was lost slowly that way by individuals having those experiences. And I'm going to give you one quick example on the fracking file. Fracking is about water. It's about water protection. That is at the heart of the worry and the fear around fracking. So here in New Brunswick, about 15 years ago, the government introduced a Water Classification Act, and Karen can help me out with this story. And so the Environmental Trust Fund gave money to all these individual volunteer watershed groups to go out and take some baseline measurements, and that would then allow for the classification of all these freshwater areas in New Brunswick. And so they did that, and then nothing. And so they began wondering, why isn't this happening? And then all these theories start to happen, as will happen in New Brunswick and elsewhere. What's behind the curtain that is preventing the Nashwauk watershed to get its results back? So they went to the ombudsman, and the ombudsman actually looked into it and wrote a report that said, yeah, like, this is crazy. I don't know why this is happening. All of that was happening, and over here, the Department of Natural Resources is saying, hey, let's consider this thing called fracking. And rather than the Natural Resources going out and starting to talk to rural residents about this, and of course, Natural Resources has no idea that this thing is happening over here in the Department of the Environment, no clue. They say, yeah, let's do that. And they say to the American company, why don't you go on and knock on some doors? So they wander into rural New Brunswick, knocking on doors, saying, hey, we're thinking of doing this thing. It's called hydraulic fracturing, and do you mind if we take some baseline measurements of your water? At the very moment when these people are fighting their own government to get those measurements. So, like, Natural Resources and those fracking companies, regardless of what you think of that, never stood a chance in the initial conversation because the mistrust was already there. It was there from a different section of government and for a different reason, but it was about water. And so that's like, and we see this happening again and again and again. Citizens don't trust government. They don't trust industry for good reasons. It was earned. But another industry comes along, or another part of government, or even another level, and are blithely ignorant to that. That's why ongoing engagement is so important. That's why understanding your communities is so important. You need to know the context that you are walking into when you're coming to talk about a new issue. You got to know what's already there. You got to know the history.
Well, I'm not going to talk about the fracking because I still twitch.
I know. Everyone still has PTSD.
But engagement. I mean, I can't agree enough about engagement. But I do want to talk about. I had over the years, I've had a chance to get to know some risk communicators, because in public health, I spent most of my career in public health. You're communicating risk all the time. And if you talk data, nobody wants to hear data. They don't want to hear the data, even though that's what it is that's forming our opinions, right? And so you have to find different ways to communicate, and it's a very tricky business. But I was talking to him about this panel, and I was asking, like, what? If you could say one thing that a scientist or a group like NBIRDT or, other research groups could do, what would that be to communicate well? And we started talking about science literacy and how people don't understand science. I have 2 degrees in engineering, and I have a hard time being able to make sense of research papers sometimes and do anything with that. And that's one paper, and you've got multiple papers.
And I have no degree in science.
And you have no, right. So it's really hard. And so I think one of the things, if we can get to the stage, because in the middle of a crisis is not when you're building trust. You don't build trust in those cases. You build trust over time. And you plan for that. It doesn't just happen. But I think what would be really interesting is if there's some opportunity for groups who are trying to communicate research to be able to build science literacy, and maybe it's starting in, I don't know how many high school students are here, but this is a perfect space to do that. Start at the people who will be making the decisions, not me, I'm 20 years gone, like, you build in, it's too late for everybody here.
I was educated in the last century.
Well, and so I feel like, maybe that's a space where there could be opportunity.
I think communication is really important, but I think science has a lot to do in repairing its own reputations. Because if you see some of the news, how many papers have been retracted? Big influential papers have been retracted because the results were falsified. They could not be replicated. When you look at, say, the top 10 papers, most cited papers it's not just economics or health, it's physics and chemistry. And when you get the data and you try and you just cannot replicate them. And so it raises this question about, well, just exactly what went on? How opaque is that? If you can't allow if your results aren't replicated using the same data and methods, then something's fishy. So we as a discipline, or we, the disciplines of science, we have a lot to do ourselves. And things are moving, things are changing in that way. So, for example, one of the most straightforward things that we now have to do whenever we publish or we present is full disclosure of conflicts of interest. Who's paying me? What potential influence or conflicts do I have? And I declare those up front, and it's really important to do that. Disclosure of data and methods. So, yeah, you can have my data, you can have my methods, and you can test my stuff for me and see if it holds up. And peer review, and all the aspects of peer review. So I think it's not just communication. I think we as scientists have a lot more to do to sort of reestablish trust and be a lot more transparent about what we're doing, and to be a lot more transparent about the limitations and the lack of generalizability about the work. There is always a tendency to overstate and say, here's what you have to do because I have the answer, because it's not that simple.
We have access to a lot of information these days. And back 20 years ago, if I wanted to look up a journal article to support a position I wanted to take in an argument, I had to go to a library. And now I can go on Google and get a list of 50 articles with citations and the exact paragraph highlighted that I'm looking for. That comes to the issue of science literacy. We have so much information. Are we getting better at learning from that information, or is it just making the discourse all that more difficult?
I'll just make one flippant comment. I'm not allowed to go on WebMD anymore. It's too bad for my health.
Well, it's like the rhyme of the ancient mariner, right? Water, water everywhere, not a drop to drink. So yes, we are awash in information, and congratulations, you now need to be your own filters and your own judges. And before, we had other means, right? So when information was controlled, whether you trusted it or not, there was officialdom. And so then there were trusted voices. So whether it was your newspaper, whether it was a university, whether it was the minister of such and such. So those gatekeepers, those curators, those filters, whatever you want to call them, they have all now been washed aside. And so, so now it's all up to you. And as we all know, humanity exists on a bell curve. So, you might be smarter than your cousin, and that's true, but your cousin's opinion now holds as much weight as yours around the Thanksgiving table. And that might be problematic. So this is part of the problem, is we are now searching for those. We still want someone to believe. We still want a voice of trust that we can look to. And so we're now searching for them on our own rather than being handed. So it's a much more active role that is expected of citizens than has probably existed ever in the history of time, because yes, we can use examples of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, but Karen and I would never have been invited to that party. So there's never been a time in history when the entire swath of humanity and of a society can read the information and interpret it. So we are reforming into different groups, and who shall we trust?
There is one historical precedent, which was the printing press in putting the Bible in the vernacular.
Very true.
To break down the church.
But women weren't educated then either, so you could have read it aloud to us, though.
So there's another perspective that sort of is leading to some of the skepticism about the power of science, and it's a view coming up from some economists who study innovation that we're actually running out of ideas. That if you look at the incremental gains that have been coming from all this effort to learn things, it's getting to be smaller and smaller impact each time at higher and higher costs. So in aggregate, we probably spend more globally on science and R&D than we ever have, but we don't see the big breakthroughs like we were a generation ago. And so there's a lot of pessimism about our ability to use science to even drive things forward or resolve big issues. And so that's where I think there's a loss of confidence just in what's coming out of it. We've got a lot more publications. We don't know how to filter them, put them together. We've tried systematic reviews, and it usually comes up more study required, which again is great for us in the university, but it's not necessarily helping the decision makers.
And it's also now impossible, if you are actually someone who is trying to come up with an opinion and you're actually doing the research, it is impossible for you to have reached the point where you're confident that you've now read enough. It's like, I don't know if this was the case for some of you, but like when I was in high school and university, I always over-researched for the essay, right? And you know that moment when you're supposed to sit down and start writing and you're like, oh my God, like I have too many sources. Where do I start? Who do I start with? Right? So it's like now like 100,000 times larger than that. And so even those of us who perhaps feel confident in forming opinion become less confident because we never believe that we have all the answers. And so we are hesitant to speak because we don't, because we're like, well, I know enough, but I also know enough to know that I haven't seen it all. And so sometimes then the stage and the microphone and the conversation becomes dominant by those who are who are assured because of their singular focus.
We have 2 microphones at the front. If anybody has any questions or comments or some insights, Dad, you are welcome to step up to either of the two microphones and participate in the discussion.
It's like the Price is Right.
That's right. Come on down.
Hello. I worked on formulating these questions, but I'm not completely confident about them, but I'm just going to...
What did I just say? Own them.
I guess I'm like what you'd call like a skeptic, but I also love science. I really do. And I love policy. I have a major in political science. And one of the big things that I hear a lot and subscribe to is that, science has factions. And I was wondering if you could make a comment about that. I know that's really broad, but...
Well, I can speak in economics. There are many, many, many factions. And as Ted alluded to before, there's a problem that when you try to replicate someone's study, there's often an antagonistic element to it that you actually want to hurt the other researcher because you just don't like them. So when I started out in economics, there was a real nasty streak that you had camps, often different universities and graduate programs, and you would see conferences where the goal was to go and discredit the other guys just to score points. So the factions are there. In economics, traditionally it was Keynesianism and monetarism. Then we had other factions coming in. I forget what we're stuck at today. It's empiricists versus theorists. So there's something about the academic culture that will always fragment into camps, into different groups. And in part, we're competing with each other for funding and attention. And so even having an event like this could trigger a rivalry that, why didn't we invite certain people to participate? So some of the challenge we have is we're hoping all this competitive activity has knowledge as a byproduct that turns out to be useful. But in other cases, we've seen just bickering and fighting sort of hold things back. So the factions are real. I think a lot of the trying to take down and discredit research is coming from some of that. There's grad students who just go through all kinds of papers and try to deconstruct them. And I don't know what their faction is anymore other than I think they're the truth seekers. They want to sort of reveal the frauds and things like that. And again, this is all feeding into none of the science seems to be any good. It all keeps being destroyed. It's never replicated. And so that's where I think there is a crisis, and they're starting to come into trying to resurrect more confidence by having better rules around what would constitute a good study.
Thank you very much. Awesome.
Yeah, and in terms of factions, I think part of it is that academics, especially at larger schools, tend to have quite a significant degree of arrogance. And so I'm the expert on this. I've done the work. And so the information flows, the communication flows tend to be one way. I'm going to broadcast the way I think it is because I'm convinced that that's the right way. And so I think there is just this, what goes along with a lot of arrogance is just this unwillingness to listen to other positions. And I think it's going to sound funny, when we get out of the ivory tower and into the real world of government, the next sort of level of ivory tower, and you realize just how little you know when you want to say, well, here's my theoretical idea, to actually see the policy-making process and what is interested, what people who want research, the questions that they're asking are not necessarily the questions that we're asking. And then I think we just generally need to be more humble and open to flows of information.
Just a study came to mind that some economists did called Does Science Advance One Funeral at a Time? And the idea that these guys had and showed is that when you have dominant researchers, they tend to have control of journals, and they control what kinds of ideas make it into the public domain. And what they discovered is that when one of these stars dies, their network gets purged from the top of the faction or the field. The total number of papers remains the same, but the group that's now in control completely turns over, and you get new ideas coming in. So I'm not advocating that kind of selective elimination of top researchers, but there is an element to which we do get this dominance that can clog things and hold ideas back.
When we're talking about policy and government decision-making, and especially with contentious issues, the media plays such a giant role in framing the debate and filtering what the public knows about it. What responsibility does the media have? And this would be a question for Lisa. Are we being currently well served by the media in terms of how they represent science or frame debate? Can we do better, or should scientists be going directly to the public?
Well, everybody gets to go directly to the public now anyways. So no, I mean, journalism is one of those institutions, much like government and science and universities, that is kind of right and kind of wrong, right? And your question and your answer about academics, I would say that attitude is the same of any purveyor of knowledge. So academics, journalists, teachers, politicians, we all suffer because we are the keepers of knowledge, and we are telling you stuff, and you are looking to us for those answers. we become very strident. We can become very strident in believing that the way I am telling you the information is the way you should be absorbing it. So what's happening in journalism right now? I mean, that could be an entirely other panel. But it certainly is a combination of a variety of different things, right? So the plummeting, so there is no industry that has been more affected by technological change than journalism. Journalism is, it exists in this weird space that it's supposed to be for the public good, but it is largely privately funded. And so it needs a business imperative to operate, right? And so what is happening as all the money has moved to online, you have seen newsrooms shrink. So as I like to use as an example, when I arrived at the Telegraph Journal in 1997, there were 50 journalists. There are now less than 50 employees of the Telegraph Journal, let alone I don't know how many journalists there are. So when that happens, so if you just take New Brunswick as an example, when I arrived here, the Globe and Mail was still delivered here. It had a reporter in Halifax. The National Post had a reporter in Halifax. CTV, Global, and CBC all had working bureaus with multiple journalists in Fredericton, Moncton, and St. John. The Telegraph Journal had bureaus in Edmundston, Bathurst, and Miramichi, and as well as in Moncton, in Fredericton, and St. John. That doesn't exist anymore. Television news has one journalist in St. John, one or two in Moncton. So Moncton and St. John, they get a couple. Fredericton, I think it's just two for each of the privately owned. CBC has more, but it is still reduced. The Telegraph Journal no longer operates bureaus in northern New Brunswick and shares news between the Gleaner, the Transcript, and the Telegraph in St. John. So when you no longer have as many people trying to tell those stories, you end up with what you have now. Because what has been affected the most is beat reporting. So beat reporting means that sometimes you would read me on A1, top of the fold, because I was breaking news. But if I was covering an issue, whether it was healthcare or education or energy, sometimes I was on page A7 because I had covered a local public meeting. And you, as the reader, came along on that journey with me, and every day you read the next chapter in this journey, and on we went. And sometimes it was boring, and it was at the back of the paper, but it was still sitting back there. Well, that is no longer able to happen. So two things happen there. A, you're not following along on the journey, but also the journalist is not on that journey either. The journalist is only ever available for the announcements. And that is how we end up with the news we get now, which is announcement-driven and lacks the context because the journalists themselves don't have that context. So print journalists are filing 2-3 stories on different topics a day. My friend Jacques Potra, who works for CBC, when he first went to CBC, he was writing for radio. Now he's filing to the web. He's filing multiple points throughout the day. So you all know what it's like in your own workforce when you get interrupted constantly through the day and you have to go to this meeting and that meeting. That is a journalist's existence. So they no longer have time to think and learn. And if they don't have time to think and learn, then you don't get that either.
Lisa, thank you. It's very important to hear that kind of thing because we talked about how science and impacts policy.
And also I would add, none of them have science degrees, right? Like my degree's in history and poli-sci. So also, because we're writers, right? We come out of the arts. So this is why my advice to young people when they say, I want to be a journalist, I'm like, go and study in university, get your first degree in the subject you want to write about. So if you want to be a science journalist, go get a degree in biology, right? So yes, that's the other problem. We just simply don't have degrees in these subjects. So there.
Do you have anything to add, Herb or Ted?
No, I was trying to get the mic.
Oh, great. Thank you.
This might I don't know, combine all of the things that have been said. It's been a fascinating discussion. I think that's a great idea for the next topic, the discussion of media and journalism. Because, Karen, you mentioned this idea of science literacy, but I think not only are we lacking science literacy, but media literacy, political literacy, which brings me to my question that is actually directed to you, Karen, and it's something to be said about, let me see here. Oh, to get both sides of the discussion to makes for better policy making. Perhaps. But does it make for better politics? The idea to sell, because this is some of the, I mean, we just look at some of the examples, and this is kind of touches on your most recent point, and everybody else's as well. But, you know, is that both sides to actually inform or just to sell social license, these sorts of things. And when we look at the most recent goings on here in terms of just reporting, here's the policy, and how in the last week, how things have blown up. Where's the science and the economics and stuff behind that? We don't know. And so the policy prescription, the policy development was so poor, and how it was sold, and you know, the politics is what's killed that, not the policy. It's the politics. The policy's interesting, but we're not going to get around to that because the politics is so poor. So there's a question there somewhere, I think.
I think there might be. I think there might be. I'll take a moment. I think that for people who are civil servants and who are working to develop policy and are considering science and all the other information that's coming towards them, you're supposed to be independent of politics. So if you are a civil servant and you want to work as a politician, then you step outside of your job and you declare a conflict of interest if there is one, and then you work in politics. So although as a person developing policy, you're aware of the politics and you run up against it, because oftentimes it is a minister, an elected official, who are making decisions on some policies, or they're being debated in the legislature in a case of an act. But as a policy developer, or somebody who's developing that content to go into a new policy, you're not supposed to play in the political realm. So you leave that to the politicians. That's their job. So I've, throughout 18 years, I hope very effectively, limited my interactions with that political sphere, because I don't want that to influence the way that I put forward recommendations when I worked in government. So I would say that political literacy is very, very important, but I think there should be another conversation about that, maybe, because I think that's outside of the work that policymakers should be doing. I think that's fair. I don't know what else I don't think that effectively answers, though.
Still taking questions?
Sure.
Lights are still on.
I have two questions. This I don't know what you call this conference is about can science save New Brunswick? Is that correct? One of them really interests me, but the first one's a general one about the healthcare decisions that were made and backed off recently. And I didn't pay a lot of attention to it, but it didn't seem that complicated to me, and I think it was more. It was like, if we do these cutbacks, it frees up doctors to see more patients and help solve our lack of medical care, family doctors. And it doesn't seem that complicated to me. Is that something where, I know you talked about DNR, did the province come to the university and say, hey, we have this many ER rooms, if we cut them, if we cut back, and we have this much of a population within a certain radius of the hospitals, can we do this? Did they ask you that? Is that science helping to save New Brunswick? Are they talking to the university about that? The other was, and I'm just curious. I'm fortunate because I'm in Fredericton, and we weren't we weren't going to be affected by that. But I'm curious to know if that is some of the science that was being used behind that policy, or if it wasn't. The other was when I heard you referring to the immigration study. We read about that. That was published somewhere recently, maybe CBC. And that interests me, a lot more. And I believe that study said after 5 years, half the immigrants are gone. They leave New Brunswick. And tying that into housing right now, is the government saying, okay, we need housing. The vacancy rate is very low in Fredericton. There's a study on immigration. You're looking at that. Is anybody saying there's X amount of immigrants coming to New Brunswick, St. John, Fredericton, Moncton, mainly, based on the projected numbers of people that are coming here and based on the needs of the local population, what do we have to build to keep up with the housing demand?
So I'll take just to save myself from answering the healthcare question, I'll take the housing question. And then after that, we'll use the call a friend and the leather lifelines. So with the housing situation, there is definitely a recognition that the immigration policy and population policy requires the adequate housing supply to come in. The perception is the vacancy rate is too low. We may have the wrong types of units. They're not talking to me personally, but I am aware that they are looking for how do they develop the policies to trigger more of those properties being developed. And again, this is getting tied in with the problems with the fiscal challenges of the province, because let's suppose that that's going to ultimately be a change in the provincial property tax or some kind of incentive that comes in. They can't just give the money up in their minds, because that's going to affect a deficit position, which then in turn could affect a bond rating. So they're kind of gridlocked fiscally. They have to figure out who's going to give in and allow them to free up some money from, let's say, an increase in a contract next year so that they can give a tax break to get more housing units built. When that doesn't work, the second strategy is you go to Ottawa and you say, hey, where's the federal housing strategy? And so what we wind up with is we're not sure which level of government is responsible for incenting that to happen. Everyone wants it to. And it's got real implications for everyone. And the public perception as well is, even when we try to solve homelessness to get more units built, there's a concern that developers benefit, but they won't see the units. And so how do we give the confidence that if we make the policy change, we'll see the units developed? And so this is where, when we look at innovations that used to be coming in, like impact investing, they've all disappeared as potential directions. But that would have been a case where you tie the policy change to some kind of outcome that's observable to everyone. On the healthcare front, they don't go to academia when it's an operational issue and they have their own data. And I think in this case, there was a perception, maybe internally, I don't know for sure, that this was an operational decision. This wasn't what we would call the big reallocation decision of we're only going to have one specialty center somewhere. And just to throw Ted out to the Sharks, his institute has done a number of these studies of changing access to care and what the impacts are. And none of that was discussed in any of this debate in the media or anywhere else. But we do have some answers about what happens when you have different levels of surgical volumes, what happens when you change access. There's other jurisdictions that study this, but I don't believe that it was prominent in the discussion about what was going on, likely because they had their own data and statistics from their own operations.
So on the immigration question, I think no one who does research on immigration thinks that the solution is just to get more immigrants to New Brunswick and then they'll take care of themselves and everything will be fine. That's only one part. That's just the labor supply. But where I think the questions do come in, and those issues around housing and supports, are that the province wants to keep their immigrants. So by doing the analysis and showing the patterns and looking at what causes people not to stay, and either, you know, both talking to them and looking at the statistics about what kind of visa category is it, what's the size of the local community that's supporting them. That then just helps point the direction for government policymakers to say, if your objective is to keep them, it's not just enough to get them here. Now let's look at how we can keep them, and then that will lead to, say, supported housing and identifying what the barriers are to immigrants staying. So that's one thing. On the question of the ER, no, we were not consulted. And as Herb said, I think they have their own numbers. It was an operational decision. But on the encouraging side, we are being engaged by government in a lot of new areas, particularly around things like, well, we're interested in the longer term effects of policy changes. So we're going to invest in a labor market policy now. What are the effects going to be in 2 years, 5 years? If we want to move beyond, there's enough recognition from enough people in government to say, it's not enough just to say, okay, we're going to put a training programming in, and we're going to evaluate by saying how many people are in the training program, and we'll call that a success. Because that's not the outcome you're interested in. The outcome you're interested in is, does it help people, move people out of poverty? Does it help them move into employment? And so they are coming to us with those kinds of bigger picture questions. But I think there's always going to be these decisions that are made internally that are seen as operational. We are always open to provide, you know, evidence and feedback and to engage. And we are working more with groups to say, well, what are your policy questions, so that when we are doing our work, we know that there's going to be more of an appetite for them. And I just want to make one other comment. It used to be the whole buzzword was always evidence-based decision-making. Everyone likes the idea of evidence-based decision-making. And then there was this subtle change, and now we all call it evidence-informed decision-making. And it's a subtle difference, but basically what it recognizes is that if we give you the evidence, your decision is ultimately a political decision, but at least you've got that evidence to weigh in. Your policy may not be based on the evidence, but at least you've considered it in weighing up the other implications. So that's kind of the best we can hope for, is evidence-informed decision-making.
So I'll wade into health. You guys did a great job with immigration. So from my read of the situation, and I have not consulted with anybody, but I will be open and transparent. I do have friends who are working on this file. So like my heart goes out to them because, and I think it's really important to note that people who work on these really complicated files, they're hard. And if any of you have worked on them, it's really, really hard. And I think it's really, really hard for civil servants, because civil servants don't have the freedom like I do or Herb does to just like wax poetic on anything and reveal everything that's going on behind the scenes. So really, my heart does go out to everybody working behind the scenes on that issue. So I think a couple of things happened, and they all kind of touch on things that I have mentioned. I certainly do think that for all of these rural communities, there is a deep sense of loss that is longstanding. Rural communities have been slowly seeing things whittle away, and they're losing things. And so, and I think we need to approach that with great empathy. And so I think if it makes sense to close ERs in the evening, which certainly the evidence suggests it does, you have to, first of all, bring the community into that conversation. Don't just tell them this is about to happen, because you also then have to figure out, and how, what can we wrap our arms around, and what's the next, what's the other path that we go down to provide some sort of assurance or help you not be fearful, and how do we do that? And that might involve other departments than the Department of Health. So even though this is an operational decision, this wasn't a great big huge policy, what happens in those communities, again, there's context. So if I just use Sussex as an example, I live in St. John, so if I use Sussex. So Sussex in the last few years, so they were certainly involved in the fracking debate. Their major employer closed when the potash mine closed. They have had a very strong community-based economic development process, and like they're kind of looking into ecotourism. So they've got a strong little community happening in there. That's what life in Sussex is like. So first of all, you know that there's a strong sense of community there that you can walk into and start having that conversation. But there's all this context, right? And how do they feel about government? I don't know. So on the Acadian Peninsula, well, a few years ago, they had a massive ice storm, right? That prompted a commission to figure out how to do it better, because the response from EMO and government departments was so poor, and from NB Power, right? It took them so long to get their power back and all these things. So again, that larger context is important, right? Because that's their lived experience. So closing the ER from midnight to 8 a.m. is just one more thing on top of everything else, right? It doesn't exist in isolation for citizens. So I think, so that's one big thing about the health issue that we're seeing happening is it existed in a vacuum when it needed to exist in context. And then I also think, just from a pure small p political, that there was a coalition behind closed doors, and there were members of that coalition who, when people started complaining, went, okay, so I'll catch you later, and left the health authorities to defend it on themselves.
We have another question at the mic.
Hi there. I'm so intrigued by the notion that was raised about maybe we're running out of new ideas to find in science because the progress has kind of plateaued. But I'm also really hearing a lot about the importance of relationships and engagement to good policy. So I wonder whether it's not so much about whether we find new ideas, but with the ideas that we currently have, how can we learn to apply them better so that it's not just evidence-informed decision-making? Maybe it's not about the decision, but about how we do it. So can you talk a little bit about how science can contribute to doing what we do better?
Why don't you take that, Karen, because that's what you do. Well, I can, and thank you, Dr. Lamptey. It's nice to see you. I'm glad you came. I'm outside of government now, for now, and what concerns me, and to address that kind of an issue, is that sometimes when you are a person who's very eager to have evidence-informed decision-making, you'll start to build those relationships and find ways to make it happen. And this is how I got to know Ted over the years, or this is how I got to know I would be part of, say, for example, there was a Children's Environmental Health Collaborative. So there are various collaboratives or partnerships or groups that you can attach yourself to. But in my experience, it tends to be people who are interested in doing that, who seek those out. And so I think that there's an opportunity for governments to start to encourage that, to say, okay, I want to make sure that all this information is becoming part of policymaking. And so it's not just on the person who's interested in doing it, but I'm going to make that a requirement. And so that comes from leadership down. That's how you get empowerment, when you get really solid leadership who's saying, I want you to go be part of this. I want my staff to be engaged. One of the things that I did and was fortunate to do, because I was asked to, was to be part of the advisory board on the National Collaborating Center for Environmental Health. And so that gave me access to information that I wouldn't have had otherwise. And it also gave me an opportunity to help set the direction for the National Collaborating Center for Environmental Health. When I first started on that group back in 2000 and I don't know when it was, 9, I think, we weren't talking even about climate change. Getting to talk about healthy built environments as part of a healthy environment file it wasn't happening, but it grew and it developed because we were all part of that conversation. So I really think if you can for any, anyone in leadership positions that are out there, to be able to really solidly encourage your middle managers or your staff or those people who are in senior positions to go out and seek those opportunities and build that in to your policy recommendations. I think that's very powerful, because it takes almost a bit of the pressure off people who are just out trying to look for it themselves. Does that help?
An observation I'll make on that is the role of science is more valuable earlier on in the process than later. And a big change over the 25, 30 years I've been doing this kind of thing is, call it 20 years ago, we were brought in when a government was fairly new and they wanted to think about what should we do. So in Alberta, they wanted to leave the Canada Pension Plan and have their own Alberta one. And so we were involved in doing the work to say, does this even make sense, before they got too far with it. Fast forward to 5 years ago, when we were working on basic income studies and food insecurity, we were brought into a federal government meeting where we were trying to make headway on that. And what we encountered was the decisions were made on the campaign trail. So there were mandate letters written before any of the consultation went. And so by the time someone like me would be brought in, our role is not to create the policy, it's to help sell the policy. And so you wind up getting policy-based evidence making, and some of that's just because the reality, you have this platform now that's developed on the campaign, and so the role of science has changed. And the other piece that switched, and I think it's the 1990s with the deficit crises, the science capacity within government used to be deep. Departments used to have scientists who actually did science and actually did R&D type work. There was a lot of capacity within government to do a lot of this assessment. And one of the costs of the deficit fighting years was the type of civil service that remained didn't have that capacity in the same way, which meant more reliance on developing the relationships external to the university. But that's not as useful sometimes as people on the inside, where you have the same degrees of confidentiality. You can have different discussions then. Like increasingly, if we were going to talk to anyone, can we go in without a non-disclosure agreement? And it didn't used to be that way. You could go in and have a conversation, but now it's just such a risk if information flows out. And there's a lot of things where I don't even want to know what they're thinking about, because you don't want to be the person associated with that information getting in the public domain.
We now live in the knowledge age, but the institutions that employed the knowledge purveyors have been depleted, which is an interesting thing to think about, right? We live in a knowledge age. We have depleted our government scientists. We have depleted our government, our journalists, and you go down the line, and we just don't have those people who do that research anymore. We've decided we can't afford that.
I think one of the encouraging signs, so policy will be made however it is. Sometimes it's ground up, sometimes it comes from the minister based on a campaign promise. But if there is a commitment that whatever the policy is, when it's implemented, to have an evaluation strategy as part of that, to be able to be willing to say, okay, we're going to do this, but we're actually going to measure, we're going to evaluate, and we will be open to changing it if it doesn't work like we expected. And so there's one example. Some of you may have heard of the Healthy Senior Pilot Project. So this was a couple of years ago. Public Health Agency of Canada gave New Brunswick $75 million to invest in programs around healthy aging, healthy seniors. And so there were community-based projects and that there were government-led projects, but each of those projects had to have an explicit program evaluation component with a logic model. What do you want to achieve? Are you going to measure the right things? Are you capturing the right information? And are you going to disseminate the results in a way that will cause policy to adapt? That is an excellent idea. Now, we can always debate about, well, what are your measures? Because you can do program evaluation pretty badly, but they kind of outsource it to us, and that's a plug for us, that by having it done credibly in third party with a serious intent not to say, okay, we're going to do program evaluation so we can tick the box and say we did it, but to have it meaningful and be open to being able to change tack, to modify if it doesn't work like you expected, I think is one way that we can build that into the policy cycle.
Can I go ahead?
Absolutely.
All right. I have a few comments. The first one is about science. science operates on long-term basis. So we all have cell phones, and some of us don't know that cell phones would not function without science that was created or was put forward at the turn of the 20th century. It took 100 years for what Einstein did in 1905 and 1915 to see the cell phone come through. It's also the scientists who usually blow the whistle. In fact, there's a clinical psychologist at Oxford University by the name of Dorothy Bishop, who just published a paper in Nature just about a month ago called the Four Horsemen of Irreproducibility. And she was talking about p-hacking, hacking, sampling. You know, that you go back, you can find a paper in 2005 by a statistician from Stanford declaring that a lot of statistical studies are irreproducible. You cannot reproduce the results. So, and these are scientists calling on what was not done properly in science. So otherwise, without scientists, you wouldn't have that option. You wouldn't have people who would have the knowledge, the actual knowledge, because today, they say about the internet, you mentioned knowledge, we're drowning in a sea of information, starving for knowledge. So, you know, anybody can Google. You can Google anything you want. You can do anything you want. But if you do not know how you critically analyze the science, then you have a problem. Now, the science that the policies are based on, maybe, say, today, we're taking science for granted from, say, the 90s and the 2000s, the beginning of the 2000s. Sometime in the next near future, somebody's going to come and say, that science on which you are basing your policies is fraud. You know, there's this business of falsifiability, right? So science has its own critics. The problem that scientists are facing today is the fact that governments have come in and said, well, you're going to race, and the first one is going to get money. And by putting these constraints on scientists, some scientists have gone astray. But I could cite papers and papers. In 2004, a fluid dynamicist from Cornell, in fact, Cornell University has come into the radar for the p-hacking problems that the professor that was getting money for FDA studies and turned out to be that completely hoax. You know, it was completely wrong. In the same institution, there was a person who published a history of a whole field in science, saying the best time for that field was when there was no government money, because there were people who were driven. You know, scientists are driven. They're passionate about what they do. And because they were driven, they kept on doing their research. And the field completely leaped out of, without money. Today, there's a tendency to look big. If I don't have $1 million project, you know, it's not a project. Institutions also, the academic institutions, have been also tainted by this constraint where the administration looks at income. Where's income? So if you look, you start looking, and you have a serious problem with how science is done today, but the scientists are coming back and saying, we're critical of what is happening, and we're going to correct it. And go and read. Dorothy Bishop has a blog. Dorothy Bishop has a blog. Just go and read how critical she is about hacking. She's a clinical psychologist. She's a pedo-psychologist. So she tells you about all the problems of HDHD, the pharmaceuticals, name it. So
I have to stop you
Yeah.
there only because we're now at
I made my
8:56. Okay. But I want to thank you because you mentioned the word blog. Do we have one more? Dr. Barry, are you going to the microphone?
I think most people want to go home, and I'm probably one of them. Anyway, I came in late and I apologize, but I was tied up. But some of the questions were asked about the health thing, and I would just like to clarify. I've been, for 10 years, I was chief of staff of Verizon. I sat on the administration. People's asked, was there evidence-based decision-making on some of the issues? The answer is that I sat on committees in the Department of Health with some very smart people who were a lot smarter than me. And I sat there as a clinician trying to give advice. The statistics on, for instance, the healthcare decision that came up most recently, and I had the pleasure of going to Sussex and telling them about their decision last week. I didn't make a lot of friends in Sussex that day, but but there are statistics, and people when decisions are made, people think that they're not well thought out. These were well thought out. They're statistically thought out. We knew back in 2012 if we closed 7 hospitals in this province that has 23 hospitals and doesn't need 23 hospitals, that we would 97% of the population would be within 25 kilometers of a hospital, an emergency room. So, it is a logical thing, and don't underestimate the work that the people who are reviewing it, whether they be in the health regions or whether they be in the Department of Health. They have studied it, they've looked at it. It's not a perfect plan, it's obvious. I'm not saying it is perfect, but they are well thought out. And I think that people have to have some trust in people. And as Lisa talked about earlier, anybody can stand up and on a podium and tell somebody they're all stupid, and and you can't do that. But I sat in meetings for 4 years looking at these statistics, and a lot of people, I'm a simple family doctor, and I saw a lot of people who told me, and I learned, and I contributed my clinical acumen to these decisions, and we had this document that was that thick and verified statistically, and it was put on the bottom shelf because people would not make the decisions, as this government has tried to make decisions that would make the system sustainable. In a province of 750,000 people with 23 hospitals, that is not sustainable, and quality will suffer. So you go back to patient safety. So that's all I wanted to say, is that they were well thought out. They are thought out, and somewhere along the line, as has been set up, you got to trust people that they're going to do the best they can. You can argue. I don't mind having the decision reversed. It's okay. The politicians have that right. I believe in democracy and leadership, but don't make the statement that people have not thought out or worked hard at. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. So thank you so much to our panelists for their insights. It is, these decisions are difficult to make, to navigate public input and policy, and hopefully tonight gave you a little bit more to think about in terms of the process and how we can go about it better.